This is Anders Gustafsson. I made this game back in 2007 and released it as freeware on the internet. For Gateway 2, I wanted to try adding a bit of story to tie the puzzles together. I was interested to see if it was possible to interlace bits of the story within the puzzles. To give the puzzles a reason for being in the world, aside from just impeding the player's progress. To make a less linear game with more options to explore from the start. I imagined I could come up with some puzzles that, upon revisiting, you had to solve in a different way than you did the first time. Designing two-way puzzle proved harder than I thought though, and I ended up with just a few of them. This originally made me rethink the more open structure of the game, and made it completely linear, but for the remastered edition I've removed those limitations so the player can explore all four gateways in any order they choose. Some players of Gateway 1 commented that they would like to explore the environments you could see in the television at the end of the game. Those environments came from old abandoned game projects that I repurposed to create puzzles. For Gateway 2, I took those rooms and made them areas the player could visit, although they are not completely the same as those you see in the television. They are more like distorted echoes, which fits with the overarching narrative about someone's repressed fractured memories. This puzzle came from a roommate I had when I made the game. In the morning, before he went to work, he would sometimes leave a message on the fogged-up mirror for me to see later on. They were usually just short taunts, but the effect of them reappearing on the fogged-up mirror when I stepped out of the shower never failed to amuse. The puzzle I liked the most was the one where you looked at another figure through the telescope, only to have him turn the situation and look right back at you. I felt the act of observing and being observed tied nicely into the nature of puzzle games. The player spends so much time looking at the environment, which is usually passive and static. When the environment gazes back at the player, the feeling was immediately unsettling, which was an atmospheric note I wanted to explore more in Gateway 2. To revolve around a central hub that the player kept coming back to. Every time the player made progress, the hub would change slightly. In the early sketches of the game, the hub contained a tree that the player would take care of and see grow. That never made it into the game. The world of Gateway didn't feel like a place where organic life could thrive and grow. Puzzles that the player has to solve twice, going back and forth. For the old version of the game, the rules for how the floor tiles affected each other were too vague, and most players ended up brute forcing their way across. If you're creating a puzzle, where the player feel more inclined to brute force their way ahead rather than learning the rules of the puzzle, you know the puzzle needs attention. For the remastered version, I changed the rules to be a bit easier to get a grip on. It's the first environment I ever created when I was trying to make my first adventure game. As with most game projects, the first thing I did was to make a little character that you could control on screen, which ended up being a version of the little gray box figure walking around in the room you're currently looking at. The second thing I did was to give him the ability to pick things up and use them with other objects in the environment. To test the system, I put a key on the ground and made the door at the back of the room unlockable. Just getting that to work felt like a major accomplishment for someone with my limited coding skill. As puzzles go, it wasn't great, but we all have to start somewhere. When I later revisited this environment, I decided to jazz the key puzzle up, and introduce the newspaper and the screwdriver. A riff on the classic stock puzzle that appears in various guises every now and then. First time I came across it was in the movie How to Steal a Million, with Peter O'Toole and Audrey Hepburn. Neil Gaiman liked it so much he's used it in no less than 2 of his books, and Al Lowe openly mocked its ubiquity in the first Leisure Suit Larry game. If you want a more exhaustive list of its use, check out Paper Key Retrieval Trick on tvtropes.org. Edition of this puzzle was just to walk across the surface of the tiles as fast as possible. If all tiles were dark at the same time, the game considered the puzzle solved and would let you pick up the tape. Ideally, you want the player to feel smart once they've solved a puzzle, like they've accomplished something, but this puzzle really missed the mark. Instead, most players would solve it more or less by chance without expending any effort at all. Version of the game, I replaced this puzzle with something a bit more involved and added another obstacle once the player picks up the tape. This puzzle draws inspiration from the famous obedience experiments Stanley Milgram conducted at Yale in the 60s. They always struck a bleak chord with me since reading about them. I always thought it would be interesting to base a game around similar scenarios where the player would act as the authoritarian taskmaster. I wanted the other character to make errors and only get the solution right about a third of the time, just to make it more tempting for the player to use the shock button. The other character is programmed to be more likely to make mistakes the more the player punishes him. There's a way to solve the puzzle by not shocking the other character at all, but since it requires a bit more work, most players miss or skip it. I thought it would be interesting to be on the other end of a previous puzzle. It plays out exactly like the scenario with the sketchpad and the phone, except that the player is now expected to play the reverse role. It's always a gamble to base a puzzle on something the player is supposed to remember, but given the short length of the game I figured it was fair. Would be easy for players to distinguish 3 different pitch values, especially since they'd already heard the sequence once before, but after releasing the game it was obvious that some players couldn't make the distinction. In response, I added a hearing aid setting which I've kept in all my games since then. It's a crutch, but it allows all players to complete the game no matter how good they are at distinguishing pitch values. Being attentive in a previous room. The painting on the wall is designed to be fairly eye-catching, but I'm not super fond of this puzzle. Separating the clue from the actual puzzle is an arbitrary way of making the puzzle harder, and something I mostly avoid nowadays. television displayed a test pattern that many of the older players recognized since it was used for the PAL color encoding system. For the remastered edition, I decided to drop the test pattern in order to reinforce the watchful presence of the mother with her signature creepy eyes. To the remastered edition of the game. It reinforces the oppressive presence of the mother, but gives the player a means to fight back. At first it seems unfair to introduce timing mechanics in an adventure game, but once the player realizes he or she can punch the eyes, the puzzle becomes very easy. This puzzle reveals a little of the story of the game. It shows how the young couple used to communicate in order to circumvent the mother. It also presented an opportunity to hint at a larger world in the darkness beyond, which is always a useful trick if you want to stretch a minimal budget. Could chew with this puzzle. I wanted it to revolve around the old detective's trick where you draw on a pad to reveal the indentations of what was written on a previous page. I could get the drawing function to work, but I couldn't make the game remember what the player had drawn, so every time you visited this screen the page would be clean. For the remastered version of the game, I decided to solve that problem. Player to lock themselves in the first time they came here, and then have to get themselves out on the way back. The first part involved them having picked up the lighter from a previous room, which is something I wasn't completely happy with. Separating an item from the location you need to use it is an arbitrary way to make an adventure game more difficult. But I also thought it was too jarring to just put the lighter on the floor of this room. Was to put the lighter where it made the most sense, next to an ashtray on a sofa table. And since there's two of those in the game, the player can find the lighter at either one. Eyes, the mother and the videotapes. The puzzle is very simple, because most playtesters got so stressed by the eyes. In adventure games, if you put some kind of external pressure on the player, like a time limit or a sense of imminent danger, it's usually a good idea to dial back the difficulty.
On another puzzle where you have to blind an eye above the door. There's a naked light bulb hanging from the ceiling, and the only thing you can interact with is the water falling from the sprinkler system. Purposely changed the colors of the rainbow, so players couldn't cheat their way to victory. Requiring the player to have knowledge outside of what the game is presenting always struck me as unfair, and though I haven't stayed strictly true to this principle, it serves as a general rule of thumb. From the player is a good way to increase the sense of drama. The player has been working hard to explore the various doors through the course of the game, and now they're all gone. Removing options is also a helpful way of guiding the player's attention. Since adventure game players have a habit of scouring the environments for clues when they encounter a difficult puzzle, it makes their burden a lot easier when the game limits exploration options and indirectly tells them that they have everything they need. Videotapes to tell the backstory of the game came from Silent Hill 2, which has always been a favorite when it comes to marrying gameplay with narrative in a compelling way. Finding tapes and transferring their contents tied into the repressed memories theme of the game and gave the player a clear sense of what needed to be done. Inspired by Brian De Palma's movie Carrie, particularly Piper Laurie's unforgettable performance. I removed the overtly religious and paranormal aspects from Stephen King's source text because I wanted the characters to remain slightly more grounded. The identity of the player character is hinted at but never explicitly revealed.
this game. It was my second fledgling step into the fascinating world of adventure game design. And though I'm a little embarrassed by some of my design quizzes, I'm proud of the game as a whole. Cheers.